we'll open with Keith Fugley, a paper with Ruben Echeverria, and laying out, the background behind this project and the estimates of productivity impacts of the CGIAR. So over to you, Keith.
Okay, so we're ready to start now.
Go for it.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, and thanks everyone for coming this morning. So what we're going to be talking about today are some preliminary results of a project that we initiated earlier this year to try to do a comprehensive assessment of the impact of crop improvement technologies that have come out of the CGIAR system of international agricultural research centers. So those of you who may not be familiar with the EARC system, it's a system of about 14 centers. It's funded primarily by the global north, donor governments, international organizations, private foundations, directed toward improving food security and sustainability in the global south. So the centers are spread around the developing countries, and I've shown here where the headquarters of this various centers are, although they have global mandates and have experiment stations located in all these different regions. And many of these centers will take on mandates for specific crop improvements, like IRRI in the Philippines does rice, CIMMYT in Mexico does maize and wheat, and so forth. The centers were first created around 1960. Some of the original centers date back as far as 1960. The CGIAR system was formed in 1971, so it's the 50th year anniversary this year. The centers themselves, as I said, one major component, but certainly not all, is their investment in crop improvement research, where they focus on staple food crops, 19 crops in particular, which is the focus of our study here. But they also do policy research, livestock research, as well as natural resource management and forestry, fisheries, and biodiversity. But the crops component makes up 50 to 60% of the total expenditures. The total expenditure of the system in 2015 dollars is now about $800 million. So what the objectives of this study really are: first, to assemble the evidence on the adoption and productivity impact of CGIAR center-related innovations in crop improvement, again, across those 19 crops, and going back to 1960, and what can we say about diffusion and impact of those technologies up to the present time. Most of it will be on crop varieties, but also where we can find evidence on crop management practices. And then second, when we estimate then a productivity shock to agriculture, can we derive implications of that shock?
Keith, I lost your screen. Have we lost his internet? I think that we lost his internet. So we'll wait just a minute, but if he doesn't come back in a minute or two, Eurus, you need to be ready to share a screen and jump in, and then we'll segue back to Keith after your presentation.
Sounds good. Yeah, let's wait 2 minutes.
Yeah, 2 minutes, guys. I have Keith's phone number, so let me just try him.
Okay, do you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you.
Mm-hmm.
So Keith, we're hearing you. You'll just need to share screen. Excellent. We're there again. Can you back up one slide? I just want to make sure we haven't missed stuff while you were talking.
Okay, let's see.
Just come back one slide if you can, or otherwise we can just go from here. I think you were talking for a bit.
Okay, so
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
are we?
Go one more slide, I think, and then we're good.
Okay,
Yep.
is this good? Okay, so
Yeah, this is good.
okay, great. Thanks for that. So basically what we're trying to do is assemble the evidence, available evidence on how the extent of diffusion of crop improvement technologies from these CGIAR centers going back to 1960 up to the present time, and then quantifying sort of the yield shock from those technologies and what the value of that would be for LDC countries. And then we are partnering with IFPRI and Purdue and broader models that they have of the global agri-food system to assess how a productivity shock of this magnitude would affect things like food prices, income, wages, and how these in turn would influence producer and consumer behavior, income, poverty, natural resource, land use, and so forth. So my talk will focus on this first component about the adoption and productivity impact of crop-related innovations. And then Will Martin and Juris Baldos will discuss some preliminary findings from what that productivity shock implies for these more ancillary impacts. So there have been hundreds of studies really that have looked at the impact of specific technologies from the CGIAR centers, but very few have attempted kind of a comprehensive aggregation of those impacts for developing countries as a whole. Probably the most comprehensive study to date was a book by Evanson and Gallen, in which they looked at the diffusion of improved varieties for 11 food crops up to the year 2000, related to rice and wheat, and most of the adoption had occurred in Asia. But they had identified that by 2000, about 170 million hectares were in CGIAR-derived modern varieties. Now, just as a preview, our current assessment raises this to about 226 million hectares. So in addition to what they found, we have a few more crops and a few more technologies. And so that's the addition that we're finding in our current assessment. Now, they don't actually provide an estimate of what's sort of the aggregate economic surplus from that innovation, but they did estimate that it may have reduced price of food staples by as much as 20%. Now, Reitzer and Kelly and Alston and Pardee and Rao more recently have looked at some of the major projects, what they call sort of the billion-dollar or big impact projects, and aggregated those. And Alston and Pardee, they estimated from 9 what they call high impact projects, and summing up all the annual benefits and putting it in present value terms about $1.8 trillion over this 60-year period. And as a preview, we try to do the same thing as they did, and we're going to come up with a figure of about $3.4 billion. So just to give you a snapshot of what we're finding. Now, there's a couple of other recent studies, too, that find very large and impressive impacts. Now, these last 2 studies don't actually look at productivity. They basically simply look at adoption of new technologies, when it became available, how widely it was, varieties spread, and then correlate that with other outcomes such as trends in child mortality or in just general economic growth, and find very strong correlations between diffusion of improved varieties and some of these ancillary outcomes. So turning to the task at hand, we draw evidence from about 147 studies. Most of these have to do with diffusion of modern crop varieties, 19 crops, as I mentioned. A few studies cover crop management, integrated pest management. The most significant ones are biological control of cassava pests in Africa. And a few studies also deal with natural resource or agronomic management in various parts of the world. So they basically provide an estimate of the crop area or crop area share under a new technology in a specific country at one or more points of time. And we try to extrapolate that to the world and how that's evolved over time. So how we do that is, we divide this 60-year period into 5-year intervals, and by crop, by country, and we populate that with these adoption shares wherever we have data, and then just interpolate between missing periods. And then we carry forward the latest available estimate of the crop area share under a new technology to the current period if we don't have anything for this last period. And so we're basically kind of freezing adoption shares at for some crops, for example, maize in Latin America, the last estimate we have is from 2000, the Evanson and Galland study. So we're assuming that the maize area in modern varieties from CGIAR centers has remained about the same, at least as a percentage of total maize area for that region since then. But for many other countries, we have more recent information. And so what we come up with is a figure like this. So we can break out so we have this summary evidence of about 226 million hectares in technologies that can be attributed to some degree to CGIAR centers. And we can see that, again, the bulk of that area is in modern varieties, especially to rice and wheat. But in recent decades, that has become more diverse, including other crops as well as crop management technologies. And initially, the adoption area was heavily focused on Asia. But in the last couple of decades, again, there's also been more diversification, especially more impact in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the second component is to say, well, how did that diffusion impact yield or productivity? And we're really interested in a total factor productivity measure of technology adoption. And we model it like this, where you have new technology as a factor neutral shift in a production function. And so you get and that affects crop yield two ways. The first is a pure productivity effect. So this is the TFP effect that raises output for every unit of input. But as that occurs, that also increases or changes the marginal product of these variable inputs. And in fact, would likely then attract more resources into the sector, more labor, more fertilizer, more capital, for example. And so you get a second effect on output or product or yield. That's the competitiveness effect, the effect of drawing in more resources because those resources have become more profitable. So for the purposes of, so when we observe changes in the field, what farmers are doing, they're moving from Y0 to Y1. But for understanding the welfare implications, we need to be able to isolate the pure productivity effect from the increases in costs, isolate those two components of the yield or output change. And then if we can, from a supply function perspective, that shift in the production function is equivalent to or can be translated into a downward shift in the supply or marginal cost function. And again, when we measure that by what we call K, which is the percent change in unit cost of production, which is basically equivalent to that pure productivity effect that we saw in the previous diagram. Now, these equations and this framework all comes out of this book by Alston, Norton, and Pardee, Science Under Scarcity, where they lay this out very nicely. And so there's no new modeling here. We're just taking what they're doing and applying it. And if we, here I'm abstracting from any price effects, assuming perfectly elastic demand. And that gives us, I would say, kind of a first order approximation of the total economic surplus effects of a productivity shock of this size. And so the key is to measure K as a percent unit cost reduction. And K will vary over time as technology becomes more widely diffused. So it's small when adoption area is small, and it will grow as the share of adoption rises as technology becomes more diffused. So it's first to measure the productivity impact, say at the level of a field, we can look at first the percent change in observed yield, but then we need to subtract the percent change in costs. Basically, what we're subtracting is the share of that yield increase that went to pay for the additional inputs that are used. That's result of that competitiveness effect. So we get this what you might call a net yield impact, or the TFP component, the pure productivity component. We can at the field level, and then we can multiply that by the area share in the modern varieties, and we can get the K as it affects the aggregate supply function and how that evolves over time. And then with that K, then we can get what I call a first order impact of the change in surplus and how that evolves over time across crops and across space. So that's the framework that we're using here to get these productivity impacts and their economic significance. So the nature of the data, very briefly, we should, there's one kind of technological change is when farmers really shift from a traditional variety to a modern variety. But then there's also a technological change when they replace their first generation of a modern variety, say, or new technology with the second or third generation, which continues to add to productivity. So the nature of the evidence is a lot of farm survey data that try to compare yields, or using experimental data comparing yields to try to get that TFP change. And then also, particularly for what we call technology turnover, next generation impacts, is we rely a lot on experiment station trial data to look at the rate of genetic gain in experiment stations, and then multiply this by the rate of variety turnover. So, if you're getting genetic gains of about 1% per year in your breeding programs, and farmers are replacing their varieties, say, every 10 or 15 years, you can multiply those two, and you can get an estimate of the yield gain every time they turn over their varieties. And the nice thing about this is that this also includes the value of yield maintenance effects. And so in these experiment stations, you're comparing yields of old and new varieties. Those old varieties may be actually losing yield if environmental changes are affecting their productivity. For example, maybe they're losing pest resistance or disease resistance, and the new varieties are helping to maintain that. And so that's being incorporated, we believe, in this approach that we're taking for measuring yield impacts of variety turnover. So just so these yield impacts we're getting, vary by country and by crop. But generally, what we're finding is that first generation technology is raising TFP by 30 to 40%, with subsequent generations by another 10 to 20%, including those yield maintenance effects. What this implies is that even as the area affected, the diffusion, sort of has begun to plateau, particularly after 2000, the value of the research continues to grow, because the value is being, because even in areas where new technology has become saturated, you're still getting productivity improvements whenever the generation of technology is being replaced. And so when we add up all of these producer surplus, total surplus effects, we're coming up with a total value of the productivity gains from CGIAR crop technologies by 2020 of about $57 billion per year during this last 5-year period. Now we can translate that, and then we can show, where that has occurred, because we know what crops and the time frame and what countries. We can see that, if you go back to 1990, almost all of the, Asia dominated where these productivity gains were occurring. In the last 30 years, that's become more diverse, especially they've been growing rapidly in Africa. They're still growing everywhere except Northeast Asia. This is basically China. And the reason that they actually fell in real terms is because apparently some of the China crop varieties have been replaced with other varieties that come from the China program that may not have CGIAR parentage. So we can translate this into a TFP shock for the agricultural sector. And these are preliminary, and this is the shock then that we sort of give to our modeling partners and say, how does a shock of this size affect these broader economic implications? And I think we're still working on how to do this. I have been so our preliminary estimates was that this basically translates into about a 2% shock to agricultural TFP, which it seems to be quite small. I believe it should be a little bit bigger than this. I originally thought that I was calculating it for the crop sector. I think what I was calculating it for the whole ag sector. The crop sector shock is probably larger. It's also, I think, we're calculating as a percentage of ex post yield. We should probably be looking at it as a percentage of ex ante yield. And so the preliminary estimates are that it's about a 2% shock, but it could be, I think, maybe 2 or 3 times this when we make these adjustments. But just to summarize what we're finding, again, technology adoption on about 226 million hectares, generating about $57 billion a year in additional output value. And again, we can see what countries are getting that value. And we can, extensions are, we can actually say what have been the returns to this research? How has that varied across commodities and across regions? And again, and I've just put some preliminary estimates down here to show what those look like. But the rates of return are likely to be quite large because the benefits are very large relative to investment costs, at least on the CGIAR side. But we should recognize that these are joint products. They involve both CGIAR investments as well as complementary investments from National Agricultural Research Partners. But now I'd like to turn it over to my colleagues to get their preliminary estimates of how these kinds of technology shocks can be modeled to look at these broader implications for poverty, nutrition, and the environment.
Great, thanks, Keith. And thanks for kicking this off and setting the stage. We do have a little time for discussion and questions of Keith. Would anyone like to pose a question? You can put it in chat or you can just come off mute. I'm not good at seeing people's hands given on my screen, but please, I think if you turn on your camera, you're going to show up in front of me. And then come off mute. Any questions for Keith about this? This is important stage setting.
I just had a clarifying question. So Keith, this is Sraboshi. I think I missed the part when you said the estimate of 2.1% increase in productivity, and that is during 2016 to 2020, but you're trying to do a longer term analysis. So I was wondering how you arrived at the 2016-2020 time period.
Well, of course, the figure here, just going back to the figure that shows these, you can look at how the extent of adoption and productivity impact in any period was contributing to agriculture at that time. So and the size of the shock is relates to not only what the productivity impact of in fields where technology was adopted, but it's also related to how widely these technologies are being used, and also the significance of these 19 crops in the total agricultural sector. So the 2.1%, is takes some numbers from this last period to just say, well, at this point in time, these 19 crops accounted for about 35% of the gross value of agricultural production in developing countries. These technologies had been diffused or adopted on about 30% of the total crop area in these 19 crops. And if on each of the hectares where that output had been adopted was about a 20% increase in TFP, you multiply those things together and you'll get a 2.1% at that period of time. Now, in Africa, it apparently is a larger share. In South Asia, it's a larger share. In North Asia and some other regions, it's a smaller share. If we focus just on the impact of the crop sector, I think it would be larger. And again, I think it's a question of, this is a percent of what? Is it a percent of current output, or is it a percent of the output that it would have been without the productivity shock? And I think we should be looking at the ex ante yield rather than the ex post yield, which is what I base these on in terms of estimating these shocks. So I think that these estimates are small, but essentially what they say is, is that in 2020, about 2% of the gross output of agriculture is directly attributed to the productivity growth, the net yield impact of these technologies on these crops.
Okay, thank you. Makes sense.
You're reading your heading that says 2.1% of LDC ag. Could you translate that into global ag? What fraction, if we spread that over global ag, what would it be?
Well, I would say that, at present, these LDC countries account for about 3/4 of world agricultural output. So you would take, 75% of 2.1%, so be, 1.5% of global agricultural value, something around that fraction.
Great. Okay, thanks, Keith. Other questions before we?
See, Rob.
I had a question, if I may, or two questions. Yeah. Keith, this fantastic work on pulling this all together. It must have been an incredible amount of work to pull this all into one coherent framework. I just wondered since it is focused deliberately probably on the crop sector, CGIAR has also contributed to livestock innovations. Is that something, and breeding of livestock, something that we can account for in a further exercise, as well as more recent contributions in terms of what, for instance, Harvest Plus is doing on biofortified food? So that's one question. And maybe the more technical question relates to how you deal with the interaction between the improved crop varieties and the change in input use. So you quantify that in the equations, but but of course, with the improved varieties, also the quality of the inputs has changed. Much more use of chemical fertilizer and so on, that which also have a productivity effect. So the question is, to what extent in your TFP estimates that's accounted for, or that's something that still would need to be included? Thanks.
Yes, thank you. So on the first question, as I mentioned, the great majority of evidence to date on impacts from these international ag research centers has to do with crop improvement. As we get better evidence on livestock innovations, I think we could also add that. The evidence on that is pretty thin to date, although looking at forage crop breeding, for example, some recent reviews of that are suggesting that that may be adding another $5 billion annually to TFP. So that could be quite significant. Most of those impacts, I think, have been in Latin America, from improved forage crop varieties. So there is, and of course, biofuel, or excuse me, the biofortification is another innovation, valued innovation that probably isn't being reflected. It's not being reflected in yield or traditional measures of productivity. And so that would, so that the typical way that that people have been looking at those impacts have been, looking at direct impacts on the health of consumers, and particularly, using measures like disability adjusted life years from decreases in malnutrition and micronutrient deficiency. So that would be an additional kind of value not reflected at all here. In terms of accounting for the changes in input use, what we're relying here again is primarily, the evidence from the field that these various, these individual studies have tried to do, and in terms of accounting for changes in costs. And sometimes, what they find is that variable costs have actually declined when technologies are adopted. Because maybe it has pest resistance, and so then they're using less pesticide or something like that. So it could be substituting for some of these modern varieties. The biggest impact, I would say, that has been, or the biggest effect of input use that has been incorporated into these estimates are increases in fertilizer use that came about when the first generations of rice and wheat varieties, especially rice, were adopted in Asia. So when semi-dwarf rice came into play in irrigated parts of Asia, there was it really made fertilizers much more profitable, and so most of most of what we're measuring here is really trying to subtract the additional costs of that increase in fertilizer use that was made profitable when these new varieties were adopted. But on the other hand, in places like Africa, there's been very little increase in purchased inputs or fertilizer, even as these technologies have become more widely used. So at least so far, we're not finding much change in costs as a result of resulting from adoption of these technologies there.
Okay, thanks, Keith. I think we are at time, ready to move to the next presentation. Apologies to Hans and for the fact that we've got this discussion time slotted in before he gets to say his bit, but we will look to you, Hans, for some kind of synthesis, overarching comments and whatever you wish to say. But come to you. So the next presentation is split between Iris Baldos and Alfredo Cisneros. So Iris, you're going to start. Go ahead. You're muted.
Yeah, mute myself. Okay, thank you. So thanks for attending this session. I'm going to present my work together with Alfredo, Keith, and Tom on understanding the impact of the CGIAR research given the new estimates that Keith has worked on. Just to give you a quick motivation of this work, and we know that productivity growth is really an important driver of agriculture, mainly useful for security and land use. And then most of the studies that try to evaluate the contribution of green revolution technologies on within this partial equilibrium and general equilibrium model, they tend to use these estimates from Evanson and Golin. And what I noticed is that they focused only on the TFP contribution, the yield growth contribution, and they didn't account for the area contribution. So in a way, most of the studies that have been using these estimates are actually focusing on the upper bound of the contribution because they don't incorporate information on the harvested area. And this is why we need to revisit this question of what's the contribution of CGIAR technologies, given the new estimates that we have right now. And in the later half of this presentation, Alfredo will talk more about how we can relate biodiversity impacts through the land use changes that we're generating in the models that we're using. I'll just quickly run over this. These are like the key examples of the studies that explored CGIAR technologies. So you have work by Rose Grant, which used the impact model. They plugged in the TFP, the yield contribution of CGIAR technologies, and they found that in their counterfactual experiment, without the green revolution technologies, you'll have a decrease in caloric consumption by around more or less 5%, caloric availability by around 5%, and a bump in terms of children undernourishment for that period. And then Rose Grant et al. They estimated the impact on child mortality, again using the same model and the same growth rates, but with a different period, and they found that there's an increase in child mortality by around 10,000 without this international agricultural research centers. Stephen Edson et al. They use a GTAP AEZ model, and again they use the same yield estimates, and they found that global cropland area in 2004 would have been much larger by around 18 to 27 billion hectares without this green revolution technologies, and that would result in additional GHG emissions of around 5 to 7 gigatons carbon equivalent. And then there's this work by Hertel et al., which used the simple model, which is the model that we're using. And they found that without the green revolution technologies, cropland area would be 10% more. And on average, green revolution technologies results in less land use change emissions of around 1,300 metric tons CO2 equivalent. So with that literature in mind, let me quickly explain the model that we're using. So we're using the simple model, a simplified international model of agriculture prices and land use. It's a partial equilibrium model of agriculture, so it only focuses on one aggregate crop commodity, livestock, and processed food. And the good thing about simple is it only focuses on the key drivers of agriculture. So for example, for the demand side, we only focus on exogenous drivers and per capita income, population, and biofuel use. On the supply side, we focus on the TFP growth assumptions. And then because it's a simple model, we could actually attach additional modules so that we can get more out of our simulations. And I'm going to talk about those in the next couple of slides. So the first module that we're using is this food security module. Basically, it converts the quantity consumed per capita for all the 16 regions in simple model to grams, and from grams to caloric consumption per day. And then when you have an average caloric consumption, and this is what we've adopted from the FAO methodology, you can then impose a distribution of caloric consumption, which is what you can see here. And then if you have a minimum caloric consumption line, you could split the fraction of the population who are consuming below that line. So these are like the calorically undernourished. And then we're just shifting the distribution based on the changes in average caloric consumption that we're generating from the model. Now, another module that we're using is this land use change emissions module. So essentially, we're just converting any change in or expansion in cropland into GHG emissions through these carbon emissions factors that we calculated from this gridded map on carbon storage on potential vegetation. So this kind of captures the amount of carbon that's stored below underground and also above underground for all grid cells. And then we just simply convert any land use change that we're generating from simple to emissions. All right. So we have the modules, we have the model. So first thing that we need to do, which is same as what people have done in the past, is to create like a historical baseline. So here, in simple, we use a population, per capita GDP, and PFP growth to simulate a historical baseline from 1961 to 2017. And then this graph just shows you like the global level results in terms of percent changes over this period. The blue bars are going to be the historical changes. The orange bars are going to be the ones that are simulated by the model. And this, we just wanted to also compare this so that we have a sanity check in terms of the direction of the changes. So in general, we tend to capture the change in global crop price, so it's declining, but we're projecting a little bit more reduction in price, and 40% compared to the data. And we're kind of understating production increase here because it's like 70% versus 40%, 70% versus 240%. So with this baseline at hand, we now generate the counterfactual scenario, and I'll just quickly run over through it. But basically, we're just focusing on the soybean, maize, wheat, and rice. In the future, we're going to extend it to the 19 crops that GTAP has generated in terms of the yield contribution. And then we're just simply deducting the contribution of the yield changes for these 4 crops in the historical PFP growth rate in order to generate this counterfactual. And what we find is, at least at the global level, it's difficult to see the contribution of this CGIAR technologies because it's really like 1% plus and minus, at least at the global level, in terms of the change in global crop price, global crop production, and global cropland use. So it's important for us to dig deep in terms of the regional changes. So I'm going to focus on the food security changes. First we're looking at average daily caloric intake. These would be the changes over this period, 1961 to 2017, and we're comparing historical baseline versus counterfactual. And if we look at like the difference between the two, some regions kind of pop out. For example, South Asia, you have a decline of around 16 kilocalories per capita per day. When you compare baseline with the counterfactual scenario without the green revolution technology. Also North Africa, you have around a reduction of around 8 kilocalories per capita per day. Now, these changes may seem a little bit small, but if we use the distribution that I showed you a while ago and impute the changes in terms of the calorically undernourished persons, you can see here that for South Asia, that small change in kilocalories is actually will drive a huge change in terms of the number of people who will be undernourished. So for South Asia, it's around 14 million persons over this period. For Sub-Saharan Africa, it's close to around 6 million persons. So in total, over this period, for these regions, key critical regions, we're seeing an increase of around 22 million persons who are calorically undernourished without the Green Revolution technologies. And then finally, here are just some comparison. I'm comparing the changes in historical baseline versus counterfactual on cropland use and also the subsequent land use change emissions. So in general, the bars here are increasing, which means that you're going to have higher cropland use in the future. Not in the future, but without the Green Revolution technologies, you have a large change in Sub-Saharan Africa. And in total, we're seeing around an increase of around 4.3 million hectares if there is no Green Revolution technologies. And if we convert that into CO2 emissions, CO2 equivalent emissions, it's around 33 million metric tons CO2 equivalent. So yeah, just to summarize, without the Green Revolution technologies for these 4 key crops, we're seeing increase in food insecurity and also environmental security worsens because you're expanding more land and you're also releasing more land use change GHG emissions. And then I'll just quickly mention that this work is still ongoing, and we're hoping to incorporate the biodiversity metrics that Alfredo will present now. All right, so Alfredo, over to you.
Hi, Yoris. Thank you. So, can you go to the next slide? Just as a recap of what we're doing here, we're making some assumptions about the productivity shocks. That's obviously going to go into the simple model, like Yoris explained. That's going to change prices, allocation of resources, and more importantly, it's going to adjust how we're using the land use, like where we're planting, where we're not planting. And the idea is here is to measure how this is going to have an implication into the environment. In particular, like carbon stocks and biodiversity loss. That's like the main idea of how we're thinking about it. Can you go to the next slide? Then, so just a recap of all the data sources that we're using here. We have the information from CGIAR, the technological change. Yoris also talk a little bit about the FAO information that we're going to be using in agricultural production. But I guess the important thing here is that we're going to try to incorporate information from several sources. For example, we have this global food security support analysis data, which is really nice because it tells us, you know, a really high resolution what's the distribution of croplands in the whole world. The downside is it's only one picture, like at one moment in time. We cannot like see more than that. For that, we're thinking of using this model of historic land use, this model of land use harmonization. And this model is kind of it's produced to be using in climate change models and stuff like that. The nice thing is that you can see like how it's changing. It actually tracks and makes some predictions about how it looked in the year 850 all the way to 2015. And so the idea is that we're kind of like try to make all this information kind of match. So like we have the information for FAO, but we only know it by country, we not necessarily by specific locations within the countries. We have this high resolution from GSID, and we have this like kind of like several pictures across time with the land use harmonization model. So we're thinking of having like kind of like use the information that we can gather from all of them, make it consistent. That's the idea. And then Yoris already talked a little bit how we're thinking of using the carbon stocks, like from this paper from West et al. But in this case, I'm gonna focus more in like how we're thinking of measuring biodiversity loss. In this case, it's all based on this paper from Sadari and Brooks in 2018, and they calculate these terms called characterization functions. I'm gonna keep talking a little bit. We'll go to the next slide. So these characterization factors is basically just a measure that translates 1 unit of square meters of land use change into a potential loss of the species. And this is important because it's a potential loss. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be losing this amount of individuals right away. It just says that it's eventually going to lead to extinction at some point. So if for example, if we're looking at 1960 to 2015, that even though that land use change already happened, that doesn't necessarily mean that those species are already extinct. It could like take a couple of decades or years more to actually happen. And this whole model, like it's based on this countryside model of the species area relationship. And it's a nice thing because it combines the species richness and kind of like the adaptability of a species. You kind of consider the affinity of some species. For example, if you go from a forest to rangeland, or like for cattle grazing, or if you go to agricultural use, that doesn't necessarily mean that all the species are going to be as affected. It's not the same thing to go into, for example, like an urban city, which can be probably more damaging to the species. So this model kind of adapts and try to measure like some sort of adaptability. It uses a lot of information. It has its downsides. There's actually other models that measure biodiversity in other terms. For example, like they look at more like the conditions of the ecosystem, like how suited it is to accommodate species. In this case, we're thinking more like of impact in terms of specific individuals. It's based on this life cycle initiative that the UNF is using right now. And basically, it's based on these 804 terrestrial ecoregions that are spread across the world. They measure plants, mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians. So we're focusing for now on mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians. Please go to the next slide. So this is the really detailed information I was talking about, the GFCD parameters. Here we're just looking at what proportion of each pixel is allocated as a cropland. You go to the next slide. But like I said, we are not looking at the changes across time. For that, we will need the land use harmonization in the next slide. And here we're comparing 2 years, 1961 to 2015. And the places in green are just places where it changed, like the percentage of cropland in each of the pixels increased between 1961 and 2015. It goes all the way to 2.7. That's the highest change that we observed for this period. And the red places are places where actually it was a contraction of cropland. We see a lot of movement in Europe and North America, like in the positive and negative side of cropland expansion, I guess, but and we see a lot of changes in South America, Africa, Southeast Asia. Please go to the next slide. So we're using this information. Here, I wanted to differentiate what's going on by decades. That's why I have 4 maps. On the top left, we have 60s and 70s, what occurred in terms of land use change. Between 80, in the decade of the 80s, on the top right, in the 90s, top left, and then from 2001 to 2015 in the lower right. You can see that there's different patterns. For example, there's not much going on in the 80s for the US, a little bit in the 60s and 70s, but then suddenly in the 90s and 2000, we see a lot of cropland contraction. Same thing with Europe, a lot of movement in the 60s and 70s in Italy, not much between the 80s and 90s, and then in 2000 we see a lot of contraction in Europe. But then we see the opposite. For example, Brazil, 60s and 70s, there was a lot of crop expansion. It kind of like stops in the 80s and 90s, and then again it like starts to glow in red in the 2000s. So just to highlight that, I mean, we have to make some assumptions about how we're going to calculate biodiversity loss in this case, because we're still not sure what to do with the contraction. For now, we're just assuming that only expansion is affecting, and we're not considering the positive effect of maybe contracting these areas and maybe restoring some sort of natural state. Can you go to the next slide? So using that information, just between 1960 and 2015, we're measuring mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians. What's the loss? And it doesn't seem that big when you're looking at a pixel, but remember you have to aggregate the loss of all these places. That's why we don't see that much red. But if you sum all of these impacts in all these places, we have a loss of 20,000, about 22,000 species that, like I said, either already got extinct or are in the process of getting extinct. Can you go to the next slide? So I apologize, you probably cannot see the silhouette. That's supposed to be the silhouette of the same map that we saw in the previous slide. But here I'm just marking the top 10 places where there was more than 10 species lost per pixel. So we see places like Peru, Cuba, Nigeria, Tanzania, and the Philippines. So just as I didn't want to just stay with the maps, so I kind of like wanted to be more like nuanced to what we're actually talking here. Can you go to the next slide? So I chose this particular hotspot in the Southeastern Asian, the island of Luzon. It's actually information that Yolanda, an undergrad, has been helping us to collect. She's on the third right. And this is a specific location. There's 9 endemic mammal species, almost 23 endemic birds. We have, like, for example, this red-tailed mammal on the lower right. That's kind of like the more characteristic of the region. We have species of bats and other birds. These are mountainous, cloudy pine forests. And the important thing here is also like not forget that it's not only agriculture that is going on. For example, in this particular ecoregion that is considered endangered, there's also mineral extraction and exploitation of trees and some other minor resources. There's many things going on at the same time. And in this particular case, just by accounting the whole area, we're losing about 26 individual species that are community. And that's all we have. Thank you. Have any questions?
Great. Thanks for that, Alfredo and Eurus. We'll open the floor to questions. I see one in the chat, and Julio, do you want to come off of mute and maybe even show your face and ask your question? Otherwise, I can read it.
Hi, sure. Thanks for the presentation. I was so I'm pretty new to this agri-food world, so that's why I'm asking if there are any human health effects to expect from this kind of crop genetic variations. Are there already studies on this? Are these to expect? I'm just curious. Thank you.
Do you want to respond? And then
Yeah, so at the moment, we're just looking at caloric deficit. So essentially hunger, which is like a basic metric of food security. But I assume that you could also extend that to, maybe if you have like information on micronutrients, that could also be extended. You could link those deficit in micronutrients to diseases. But currently, we don't have that particular framework, but I think that's a good place to extend this work.
Keith, are you available to chime in? Do you want to say anything about that? You've been thinking about this, or others?
Yeah, sure. No, I think that, I mean, there have been some studies that have basically what, the approach that has been taken is to correlate where technologies have been diffused with health outcomes in those areas. So, some of the previous work has found, for example, that in areas that had more diffusion of improved crop varieties, you saw sharper reductions in child mortality, and there's been and there has been some efforts to to link it to also the more direct measures are to look at as Eurus was doing, per capita caloric consumption, and then looking at the share of the population that is meeting its basic caloric needs. So there have been those both direct and indirect effects of trying to model those health impacts.
Okay, thanks, Keith.
Thanks.
Other questions?
Yeah, may I come in? This is Rob Vos. Just two quick questions, one for Eurus and one for Alfredo. To Eurus, it's again on the estimate of the impact on food security and the prevalence of undernourishment. The question was not entirely clear how you deal with the shifts in distribution, because the FAO methodology looks at the parent consumption at the national level and then uses a distribution parameter to get to the number of people that are below the minimum threshold. So to what extent, because that would be of interest for this research, the productivity shocks because of the CGIAR research is pushing not just for changing the production levels and the cost of calories, so to speak, but also to what extent is it shifting the distribution parameter? Is that endogenous to income changes in the rest of the economy, relative price changes, and so on? So the way we do it, and Martin will present it later on, is we link the global model to a whole range of micro data with household level distribution data, so we can endogenize the impact through level. Then my question to Alfredo was not entirely sure what you showed in terms of the biodiversity impacts. Is that just observed overall in terms of the change in land use and so on and habitat because of what's caused by the major crops that you looked at, or to what extent is that caused by the CGIAR innovations, right? So that's the question: to what extent is that isolating the CGIAR impact? And I guess being part of the CGIAR system, we don't want to be accused of destroying all the biodiversity and the habitats around the world.
So yeah, let me take a crack at the first question. So so for the distribution parameter assumption in the model for the caloric distribution, unfortunately we just fix that when we're doing the future projection. So all of the action that you're seeing that in terms of the change in average caloric the undernutrition count, that's going to be from the changes in the mean. But yeah, I think we need to think about maybe we could impose some shifts too in that parameter, this caloric distribution parameter. Yeah, so over to you, Alfredo.
Yeah, no, this is just a calculation of what happened between 1961 and 2015. Like, we haven't really isolated what's the impact of CGIAR. I mean, this is just how to show like how we will do it. We still have to figure out some other stuff, like for example, this crop contraction. What are we going to assume there? Like, ignore it, or like assume that there's some sort of like gain? We're still figuring it out, but we haven't really combined what Julius is doing with what the biodiversity. I guess it was just to show how it will look and what the distribution of what actually happened.
So yeah, let me chime in briefly also in answer to Rob. I was also listening to your presentations. It might not have been entirely clear that this is intended to converge, that when URIS has the global gridded model running, that will generate the counterfactual, that will generate the pattern of land use change, that will generate the pattern of biodiversity effects. So presumably worldwide, more land use change without the CGIAR will result in more biodiversity loss than was observed in this baseline. But Alfredo was just doing a baseline exercise to evaluate this methodology for translating observed, in this case, observed cropland change into biodiversity changes. But that's, thanks for clarifying that, Rob, with your question and Alfredo. I guess we probably need to move on. And our next speaker will be Will Martin from IFPRI, and bringing in the CGE perspective to tie it in more closely to this GTAP community. Over to you, Will.
Great. Thanks very much, Tom. Can you see the screen?
It's coming in.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Let me try to move it. Okay, great. So thanks very much. This work builds on Keith Fugley's work and is with a range of my colleagues, including Rob, who's online, and Abdullah, who's online this morning. So the goals, first, is to adapt the yield estimates to create productivity shocks that can be implemented in a CGE model. We then, we use the global CGE Miragradep. We assess the impacts of those productivity shocks on prices and wages using the CGE. And then we take those prices and wages and the productivity shocks at the household level, and we use that to assess poverty and social impacts using 300,000 household models. As you'll see, we've added quite a few features to the model on emissions and so on that give us a range of other estimates. This graph repeats Keith's graph from the earlier presentation. What I want to highlight here is that for the moment in these initial simulations, we've just done wheat and rice. These initial simulations are purely exploratory, so we want to see what we find, and we envisage that we will need to dig deeper. But those two commodities, rice and wheat, account for about 60% of the total gains. So that gives us some idea of how far. We're not going as comprehensively as Urus and Tom and Alfredo. We don't go to the next, we don't add maize, and we don't add the, and soybeans. But just these two commodities are very, very important. Keith's proportional TFP shocks, as Keith mentioned, these are not expressed as productivity shocks, say X% increase from the initial level of technology. They're X% over 1 plus X%, which when we're doing the simulations is absolutely perfect, because what we do is to remove the impact of the CGIAR technology from a database that includes the CGIAR technology. Looking at these numbers is actually really interesting and important. What we're seeing here is that average of about 2% productivity. That's actually much smaller than you see from many other estimates. Why is it so much smaller? Keith alluded to this. He's very careful about the area that's planted to CGIAR varieties. A lot of the time, people use that raw increase in productivity, that 40% in the first adoption, another 10 or 14% accumulated on top of that in the move to subsequent varieties, subsequent generations. Keith's very careful, and I think maybe a bit conservative, with that 30% adoption rate. And I think one thing that is important for us is to look at what's happening to the grandchildren. What about if it's not a CGIAR variety, but one that builds on the CGIAR? When we focus on poverty impacts, what's really important now in 2021 is that the biggest productivity impacts are in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia, because that's where practically all the $1.90 a day, the extreme poverty, is concentrated in the world. Back in 1961, most of it was in East Asia, especially China. But that's an important feature of these TFP shocks, which will influence the results that we get. Now, yield versus productivity. Keith alluded to this. If we have evidence from experiment stations, and some of Keith's and Ribbon's evidence is from experiment stations, that should be a pure indication of productivity change. But a yield increase is not just total factor productivity. We often use this terminology. A yield increase is an augmentation. A pure yield increase of the type we see on an experiment station is not just augmenting factors, it's augmenting intermediates as well. So that's something we need to take into account, and we haven't done that at the moment, but it's easy enough to do. Now, field experiment stations, there is a problem. Experiment station rather results, they might be biased downwards. If you start off with the intermediate input mix that was used prior to the Green Revolution, you used a whole lot less fertilizer and water. I think there's some really interesting studies from Erie in the 80s, Hurt and Capule and others that pay a lot of attention to this. What's being augmented? Is it just the variety that grows, gives you higher yields wherever you grow it? No, it turns out that the augmentation is an order of magnitude higher, or much higher at least, in the case where you're using water and fertilizer. So there's an augmentation, a productivity increase that we need to pay a bit of attention to, so that actually makes these estimates of yield increase perhaps too conservative. What about farm yields? Well, they may be biased upwards. because as Keith mentioned, you get an increase in yield, partly because of higher productivity. But you get an increase in the effective price of output. It's now more profitable to do what you were doing, but with the new variety. That leads you to use more intermediate inputs in response to higher effective prices. That then leads you to a question, what do you do about those increased costs? In much of the partial equilibrium analysis, you take those costs away as a negative component of the productivity change. I don't believe, and in the paper we argue, that it's not appropriate to do that when you're putting it into a CGE model. Because when you put it into a CGE model, the CGE model takes account, as a productivity shock, takes account of the fact that, oh, productivity's gone up, the effective price that I receive has gone up, it's more profitable, I'm going to pull in more inputs in order to take advantage of that productivity. So the total output effect you'll get at constant prices in the model is greater than the pure productivity effect. The total cost rises endogenously as a consequence of that. So you want a pure productivity effect that's stripped of that output increase associated with the higher productivity. Now, if you had observations of farm yields at constant prices, they'd be too high. The yield increases would be too high because you're pulling in more intermediate input. But in fact, what happens is that even at the national level, and this is really striking in the Golan, Hansen, and Wingender paper, is that the prices of the domestic good fall. And it turns out that in the, so that's in kind of, that's getting at what happens in the real world. In the model, the price falls as well. The actual price of the commodities fall because and this is in a model based on the GTAP parameters and database, the effective price rises, but the actual price falls. So you get this more or less wiping out of the increase in the effective price because of the fall in the actual price. So what we've concluded is it's okay to use the observed yield increases as the increase in productivity. I think this is a very important, contentious assumption that needs to be scrutinized very, very carefully. And as I mentioned, we've used total factor productivity in rather than multi-factor productivity, rather than the productivity of all inputs increasing. That's something we need to rectify. Actually, 50 years ago, that wouldn't have mattered much. If you look at very poor countries, agricultural output is almost all value added. But if you look at Indonesia, you look at China, there are now huge amount, India, massive amounts of intermediate inputs being used. So what about increases in fertilizer and other input use? As I mentioned, accounted for in the CGE as additional inputs are drawn in. Okay, the model-based analysis, whoops. As I mentioned, we use the Miragradep global CGE model. That's an extension of the Mirage model. It's very similar analytically and especially in data and parameters to the GTAP model. It generates price and wage changes. It gives us estimates of food costs, land use change, agricultural emissions, and other important outputs. We then take the Pavana database and household models, 300,000 households. It's very simple first-order impact models. Take the productivity changes for home production. We impose the price and wage changes that come from the GE model, and then calculate changes in income at the household level and use those to work out the changes in poverty rates. So the experiments we're using here, removal of CGIAR TFP increases from the original database. And the RICE results are primarily derived from field experiment stations. then we see quite a range there. One that I think that's really striking, is the China result of only 3%. I worry terribly about whether we have some CGIAR effects that are there in the grandparents or parents of the current varieties. I'm sure Keith's looked at this very carefully, but this is a strikingly small estimate. Won't actually matter too much for our poverty numbers at the moment because there's no poverty to remove at the $1.90 a day, so it doesn't really matter too much what that productivity shock is. But when we redo the analysis more comprehensively, it will matter. So then Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, quite large falls in productivity. These are similar in order of magnitude to the increases in productivity that the CGIAR caused, slightly different because of the X over 1 plus X. Then Pakistan, India, minus 6.9, surprisingly small. And Central America, quite large. Small in Nigeria. Nigeria not so important in rice in any event. Okay, on the wheat side, very small in China. Doesn't really matter what number you put in for Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam. Then some quite big numbers in India, 23%, Pakistan, similar, Mexico 30, Argentina 47, 15, Central America 32, Nigeria 99. Well, since there is so little there, that just tells you the yields initially were miserable, highly protected, a few little wadis in the north, not important. Ethiopia matters there, East Africa of some importance. One thing that I think is actually interesting, and I hadn't thought about until yesterday, is the omission of the former Soviet Union. Are we missing something there? That's an awful lot of wheat there. It wasn't part of the original paradigm. The CGIAR was formed in part to increase productivity outside the former Soviet Union. Has it come into the former Soviet Union to an extensive degree? Okay, so the changes, the results, national real income, this is global, 0.09, real farm income, goes down. And now this is something where a lot of economists, agricultural economists, worry about terribly, but I think this is actually a good thing. So one might say, well, farmers are worse off. Why are farmers worse off? Because the elasticity of demand is high, is very low, I'm sorry. Price elasticity of demand is very low. Productivity rises, the price falls. I think we should be quite, explicit and recognize that. This is the opportunity for farmers and the children of farmers to stop being farmers and to be part of that massive transition that takes poor countries with 80% of the workforce in agriculture into rich countries with 1.5% of agriculture and still, like the United States, potentially able to export. Real farm income per worker, that comes down. And that's a transition problem. If you're trying over the span we're doing, and we're doing this actually comparative static, trying to move farmers out of agriculture, there's imperfect transformation. There's a CT frontier. Here we experiment with the elasticity, but you've got to expect that farm returns, farm income per farmer will go down. Farm employment, that goes down. Not going down enough to remove the loss of farm income per worker. Poverty comes down. This is starting from about 9%. So this is actually a very tiny reduction in poverty, 0.3% of 9% globally. So that's something. Now, partly this is coming because of the shocks, because Keith has been careful and not attributed productivity gains to areas where there are no CGIAR innovations. But healthy diet food prices, if you look, this is actually causing food prices to come down of more nutritious foods, the desirable diet rather than a very calorie-oriented diet. What happens with emissions? Land use change is the dominant thing. There's a small saving in land use. There's a big reduction in the area of cropland. There's a bit of an increase in pasture land. Incomes have gone up. people have shifted their consumption pattern. You don't need as much cropland, but substantial reduction in emissions from land use and land use change. In developing countries, the impacts are bigger, as you'd expect, in all of these things, but the broad sort of story remains very similar. It's interesting to look, and in the paper we look at a number of individual cases, but Bangladesh is particularly striking. National real income goes up a lot more than on average. Real farm income comes down more. Differentiated product, Bangladesh rice, its price falls. Farm employment goes down much more. Poverty comes down much more, and that's starting at 40%. So that's actually a fairly big reduction in poverty. In this case, healthy food, diet food prices actually go up. And what's going on here is that agricultural land use, there's more pressure on agricultural land use. Productivity rising a fair bit in one country has a big impact. And that's just the Matsuyama point. A rise in productivity in a single country will actually cause you to use more land rather than less. And there's a big increase in animal products as well, because of the bigger increase in income. Okay, to conclude, and leave plenty of time, I hope, for discussion, the CGIAR system focuses on crops produced by small, poor farmers and heavily consumed by the poor. You really expect to see big reductions in poverty with that kind of focus, disproportionately larger than if you were raising productivity somewhere else, like in information technology. This study aims to evaluate the impacts, builds on a careful analysis of the impacts of CGIAR crops on yields, focusing at this stage on rice and wheat. In this stage of our analysis, we use yield increases as a proxy for increases in TFP, and we should use, and we will use in the future, multi-factor, all input productivity. We estimate wage and price impacts with a CGE and then poverty using household models. Preliminary results point to modest poverty reduction. The productivity gains are smaller than implied by elasticity and R&D investment models that we've used in the past and worried about because we're so uncertain about those elasticities. There are collateral benefits in terms of dietary diversification, the fall in the price of healthy foods. There are collateral benefits in emission reduction. This is work in progress. We're going to broaden the base of the crops. We're going to move to a total input productivity increase, and I think this is an important question we want to compare to with the results, the analysis Urs mentioned. The final thing we want to add to this is a backcasting approach. Now, even if you had a lot of productivity increase in China, by imposing a productivity increase on a database at the end of the sample period, you're going to find not much change in poverty because everybody is already quite far, not everybody, but almost everybody is already quite far above the poverty line. If you start off by moving the database back so that you have a lot more dependence on agriculture, you have much lower wage rates off farm, and then move forward so the CGIAR productivity increases in parallel with other sources of poverty reduction, we would expect to see a bigger reduction in poverty. Thanks very much. Happy to answer any questions.
Great, Will. How about if we kind of focus our questions at this moment on kind of targeted clarification, what were you doing exactly, Will?
Mm-hmm.
And
sure.
then we come in with Hans, who we've been kind of shortchanging by having pre-discussion before his discussion, and then we circle back to the bigger questions. That's what I would propose at this point. Along those lines, Will, one question you mentioned, the difference between factor productivity and multi-factor or total factor. If I understand it right, you've only applied the TFP shock to the value-added component. Is that right?
Yes, correct. Okay. And that yeah. And that question is whether Urs did that as well. I was hoping to ask that question before, but that's something we need. Yeah.
Just a point. Yeah, as people can see in the audience, this is all being worked out real time. So
Yes.
get together and talk about the results, which is great. Yeah, URIS was applying it at the top of the production tree, so
Okay.
it's all factors. So
Well, including intermediate inputs.
yeah, correct.
Right. Okay, good. Yeah, so that's something that's biasing our results down, especially when we're using modern databases where there are lots of intermediate inputs being used in many countries.
So other questions for Will and team here on this ambitious CGE analysis of CGIAR. Show your face, come off mute, and chime in if you like. Well, I think I'm going to suggest that we transition to Hans, because I know he's itching to get in his oar, and I'm sure he'll have a lot to say about the CGE stuff, as well as others. So why don't we let Hans come in, and then we'll come back to broader questions and where the project's going and these differences. Hans, give you the opportunity.
You raised too much expectations, Tom.
I mean, I'd have to tell the audience that Hans has only recently received the presentations to comment on, so appreciate that.
Do you see my presentation?
Yeah. Can you go full screen?
Do you see it now full screen?
And I'm not. I'm still seeing it. I mean, if you could just widen it.
Maybe I can try.
Yeah, don't mess around too much. I mean, what we're seeing is good. So oops, we lost you. Try one more time.
Oh no.
Okay,
Do you see it now, Tom?
Yep.
Oh, that's excellent, Hans. Thanks.
Yeah.
So over to you, Hans, for your discussion.
Yeah.
Thanks for
it's a topic that Tom knows, and maybe that's why he asked me that I like a lot. Indeed, my preparation was limited, but I tried to do my best, and I think also a couple of points are already raised in during your presentation discussion. So I hope not to duplicate. And I have also I just have to say already that I have a couple of colleagues, Susanna Kreskova and Michiel van Dijk. They are very much interested in this topic. They contributed a little, but the time was little. So yeah, I think the general it's a very important research, and if we think a lot about the issues of the future that we are dealing with, climate change, food security, whatever comes to the agricultural sector, it boils down also to a lot to tech change. So and what does R&D contribute to all of these problems? And I think if we have the Green Deal now in the EU or whatever, these are very key questions. So what are the revenues related with R&D? And then of course a very important player in the world is the CGIAR Institute. So and that's why it makes this study so interesting from many fields, not only from a CGIAR perspective, but I think it has more general implications of bringing all kind of R&D developments inside our system. And I hope at some point that it might be also endogenous. So first of all, I think this will be very. I think the setup of the study is very nice. You have very good in-depth empirical analysis by Keith. You try to go to many studies and try to do the best, and then you get both in the very interesting simple model, the PE model, to take more the agriculture, more detailed perspective, and then taking the CGE model that brings in also the income and expenditure effect. So I think the setup is really it's promising. But anyway, I have also a couple of questions to you. And first, I start with Keith's paper, and I wondering is you do a meta-analysis of 147 studies. Oh, I get a lot of noise. Okay. Tom, do you hear a lot of noise? Or?
It was me. It's raining out. I'm
Yeah, I was just wondering, Keith, how do you select these? Did you do a systematic literature research that ensure that all studies are captured? Because if the literature is not collected systematically, there might be a selection bias, and often that's a positive bias. So I just did you perform some checks on this? Who are there, and if so, if not, then how this might affect your results? I think the other thing I think you mentioned already in your talk is that CGIAR and also Rob Vos I think was mentioning it. If many things like also the livestock, the fisheries, and the forestry. Would it also be possible to assess their impact? I think you said already if you have data or something, you might go that way, but it's more difficult to get evidence on livestock because crop yields is of course easier to measure than the yield of an animal. And yeah, I put it in. Can you speculate how big this effect might be? Let's see that I get to the next slide. Yeah, and this is a key question I came up all my mind. So on one hand, Will was just saying maybe you underestimate things, but now I was thinking how much can you really contribute to CGIAR institutes from all these crop productivity gains? It's you go back to varieties, but I think these varieties they might have also because I think Will was pointing to the part from you have the varieties and they might have children in other parts, but do your parents are children of varieties that are developed, for example, in other countries? And it comes a couple of things back. And I'm thinking also to Wageningen University, who does a lot of these things, and then these varieties go all over the world. So I think, how do you take that into account? Yeah. And then TFP versus bias tech change. And I think a little bit Will was also alluding to that part. That TFP is that really the best part you can always do, because we know that quite some technologies bias tech change. They favor all land, they save labor, they save land, and we know that a lot of technologies, it's not really TFP shocks. Like they use more water or fertilizer if you have the green revolution. And in principle, and then I go a little bit already to Will in the past, that the CG model could be at least useful to do that part if you have the analysis. And the TFP rate, I cannot see it very well. So the TFP is derived using yields, area, and cost. And I think the way you do it, and I learned now that you take it from Pardy and others, but for me it was different from the classical approach. And when you have growth in outputs and inputs, so do you have any idea how these results compare to classical TFP estimates for public and private agriculture R&D? I think where you are very familiar with. Are they comparable in the same rate? And if not, why not? So do you have comparison at some point where you can compare the more traditional methods with this new with this different method? And yeah, I think it is always easy to ask, but it would be very interesting if you know that CGIAR investments are comparable with private investments. Yeah, and then a point, I think I think you mentioned it also already, that in these days climate change is very key. We have in Europe the Green Deal, and also what's the role of CGIAR in reducing emissions? Does productivity improvement goes hand in hand with emission savings? It does, of course. I saw it, I think, in Will's model and in some others. And are there new interesting technologies for the farmers in developing countries in this area? So they might not even contribute a lot to yields, but especially to emission savings. Yeah, and this is a key thing for me. as it goes back a long time. I think it was the first GTAP application I ever did is R&D and R&D spillovers. So how much can you really attribute to R&D of CGIAR, or is CGIAR connected with a network across the world with all kind of universities in the US, in Europe, and it's all a network, and that the CGIAR institutes are somewhere between the fundamental knowledge and the applications in these countries. And of course, would it have been happening without that? Because, for example, I know that the Netherlands invest a lot of foreign development money also in these countries, partly by CGIAR institutes, but also partially outside these things by bilateral agreements and so on. So this is a little bit how much of the benefits can be contributed to CGIAR and to NARS related to other countries like the Netherlands and other countries. So can all benefits be attributed to CGIAR, and how is this distributed? I think this are and then but in general I like it very much, and also the Balders paper now also some results. So what I found is it's very nice set up also. It's and I like a lot of the details you bring in this modeling framework. And I was also very impressed by that you have this real backcasting use of a model. So it seems really a very nice laboratory experiment. It's giving interesting insights. And the counterfactual, I think you get in this way, you will never be possible to obtain with econometric estimates. And this is maybe quite a tough question, but would it be possible to do this with the CGE model? Because now we have the CGE conference, because it would require a lot of data, input-output structure consumptions. I know that Peter Dixon did it once, I think, historical closure for, I think, the Monash or the Rani model. I think maybe at the same time he's presenting something at this conference, but what would be your take on this, and what is your advice given the GTAP community, as you have the founder of GTAP on board? I think we will have an answer to that. And this is Simple G covers in detail the USA. If you understand correctly, the land supply elasticities are the key parameters in the model, and very key in this model, and also very key, I think, if you transfer it with the biodiversity models. And they derive from spatial data from the USA and Latin America. So these are very land abundant regions where you take land in and out of production. And so often land is converted into cropland, and you can derive all these price elasticities for each grid. But is this also useful for other countries in the world? And we also think, for example, in the EU, probably it might be very difficult to derive such elasticities because not much available land is left, and we see land abandonment. In this context, how do you derive in principle the grid cell elasticity for other regions than the Americas? And assuming that these use land supply elasticities, and this perhaps also substitution elasticities and parameters in the model that are derived from contemporary data, also applicable to historical periods. In principle, are they long or short run elasticities? And now I had some remarks, and so the impact is mainly on SSA and South Asia. And my question was, is it just because you have the food security issues, and in other regions, in principle, you don't have the food security issues, and therefore you see almost no impact over there? You use the measure of kilocalorie per capita per day, food availability per person. And then I asked here a couple of questions, but now I understand that maybe this part is taken on board by Will's work. But I said, is food access not one of the key problems in these countries? It's the food purchasing power of the poor, that you also look at income developments. Do you anything related with this in your model, or do you leave that now, if I've seen the last presentation, totally to Will? And this is the second. This question is also related. What's the impact of CGIAR research on disposable income of poor and the farmers of unskilled people? And and this is also a question, and I think I will repeat it, and also maybe also for Will. Do we need, if we have this TFP shock, in principle, we need less unskilled workers, is my guess, because it's inelastic demand. You have a shift of the supply function, and in principle, we need less workers. This means a pressure on the wages of unskilled workers who are often in the segmented factor markets are locked in these sectors. So I'm not sure whether it will be good for these people, but it's maybe it might be good to from both sides, from the PE and the CGE model, to reflect on this. I think, yeah. Yeah, and the same a little bit for the land use. But I'm a little bit locked in our own model. I have to admit, higher land productivity leads to lower land use. And I was thinking, is there a counteracting mechanism that keeps land into production, but it leads just to land extensification? So less input use, less labor, but it's not throwing land out of production. But maybe this is pure the European perspective, where you not a lot of cases you see that higher productivity of lower productivity leads to land is getting out of production. It's just that it's used less extensively. Yeah, the biodiversity, I like this part to also include the biodiversity, because I think it's very good to extend, and I think then you need this global gridded version. That seems at least necessary. But I was thinking, do I get the impression that your function is only dependent on land use? And I was thinking, can you maybe also make more linkages with fertilizer pesticides use? Because as far as I remember, they are also part of the simple model, if I saw the diagram that was presented before. Yeah, Will, I just saw your presentation live. Just one warning, a little bit, because it's at least when we do these analysis in the Netherlands and so on, it's an IFPRI model assessing CGIAR activities, and IFPRI is part of CGIAR, and is a stakeholder. And this is always, at least in our case, always raises questions. So in the Netherlands, we are often not allowed as Wageningen to do these assessments where we are involved ourselves. Yeah, there's a couple of remarks that if you remove the impact, it's much smaller than you expect. So Keith is conservative. You talk about the parents, but you should also look at the children, and yeah, just be careful that you don't move in one direction. On the other hand, I have to say, if you use the Mirage depth model, it's a well-known, established model, maybe one of the best in this field, and this probably is more than enough to balance my first argument. Yeah, and also I had a little feeling, but if I understand Bill correctly, that can you bring in some factor biasness, and this is very much dealt with in CG models. I can remember that Chikuno Wang and us did some studies on that, and it makes quite a difference if it's just factor productivity only for the factors, and I think that was a point that Tom raised, or is it for all factors? And I think that was a big difference between the two approaches, where you have to get on one line, because it makes quite a huge difference. So, and I think my point is related to that. Not sure pulling in more inputs. Not, yeah, this was, yeah, I think there was a point. So if you have a TFP, yeah, that's what I said. You said if you have a tech change, you pull in more inputs. But I think this is related with how you modeled it. Now I understand it, because if you have a normal TFP shock, then you would also save on the inputs, because you would save on all factors. And then given an inelastic demand in agriculture, you would save on the inputs. But if I understand you now correctly, you have only the TFP shocks on your production factors. Yeah, and then you say it might pull in. Okay, that will be an outcome of the model. But maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that. Yeah, I was wondering, the healthy diet prices in Bangladesh were going up. So where did it come from? Because in principle, you implement TFP shocks. So if healthy diet prices go up, so is it an indirect effect or something? And then the land emissions, you had the key reduction. And then I was wondering how in Mirage they model the land market. So I have the feeling that also if you have this productivity, that land is taken out of production, but you could also have the extensification. And then this is related with my wages of the poor, unskilled labor for the food access. And again, here I put in the point that it might be the wages of the unskilled labor might go down. And then I think you said it yourself that if China has no poverty, but if you go 60, I think to the 1960s or something, the last 50 years, then they had a lot of poverty, and it might have contributed in the past to that it has now less poverty than it had before. So these are, I realize quite a few points that I raised, but I hope that you can respond and they might be useful.
Thanks, Hans, for putting this together, and to your colleagues for putting this together on short notice and very comprehensive. I think very thought-provoking, perfect timing, really, from the point of view of the project. So that's excellent. I'm going to propose the following. I'm going to ask each group of authors to pick out 2 things from Hans's list that they think are most important and deserve attention, and we'll cycle through again for other things as time permits. But I'm going to start with Will because he got shortchanged a moment ago, just to get, so Will, 2 important things that you want to single out and respond to, and then we'll go to Lewis and Alfredo.
So I'll pick up certainly on Hans's point about factor bias technology. That probably could make a difference. We know from some of the earlier work like Hurt and Capule that productivity is actually biased in a number of different directions. That fertilizer, for instance, is not just factor biased, it's actually if the marginal productivity of fertilizer rises a lot because of these varieties. It was very low before you put the fertilizer on, it grew magnificently, and then it all fell over, lodged and died. Now you take that away, productivity of fertilizer, productivity of water, productivity of land rise disproportionately. The problem is, we only have one dimension in our results. What we see is a yield increase. So it's actually hard to infer from that. You need other information. Hurt and Capule, they actually got estimates of field experiment stations, productivity increase if you had water, if you had fertilizer. So in principle, that sort of information exists. You also have to worry about, if you go down that path, you have to worry a lot about the elasticities of substitution. To get this observation that you use a lot more fertilizer, even though fertilizers become more productive, you've got the effective price of fertilizer falling, you need less of it, you need a high elasticity of substitution so that your substitution effect will outweigh the input saving effect. We simply don't have the information to do that, and I don't see much prospect of getting it. So my inclination is that we really want to use this multi-factor productivity, on which we have some information. We recognise that it is sort of flawed and imperfect. The rising prices for healthy diets point about Bangladesh. I think what's going on, there's a big enough increase in income that people are pulling in, the income elasticities are pushing up the price of this sort of mainly animal products. But that's unusual. You didn't see that in the rest of the world. But that's part of the reason I pulled out Bangladesh, was that interesting case of big income increase. Thank you.
Will, could you also address the backcasting issue? The session I was in first thing this morning was with Dixon, and they were doing a decade of very elaborate historical analysis and just showing just how challenging it is.
Yeah.
Were you guys thinking about taking this all the way back to 1961?
Right.
Is it possible? Is it feasible? What are your thoughts?
No. But I think we could make a lot of progress. The example that I mentioned is China, right? So you've got hardly anybody even near the $1.90 a day poverty line, and then you do an experiment where you take away a small productivity shock, you get no, you get no action at all. There's no poverty change. But in fact, this productivity shock over the long path from 1970, say, when poverty rates in China, I don't know, we don't have good surveys, but they were 50% or more. That productivity shock from the CG system is part, and that productivity shock, as Keith mentioned, was actually bigger in the 80s than in the 90s than it is today, because there were more CG, more adoption of CG varieties. So, but some simple kind of backcasting. So in the household model, we impose productivity shocks, we impose price and wage changes. So the households have, the farm households in the survey, you take away productivity, they become poorer, you lower wage rates, you can do something to move to something more like the structure that at least was the average over the path rather than just the end. And then you have these two shocks coming together and you can attribute. I mean, it's a line integral sort of issue, so there's no perfect way of doing it, but you can attribute a portion of the reduction in poverty to the CGIAR effect. If you do that, it's going to be crudely done, it's going to be rough, but it'll capture the essence of something that we are not seeing by using survey results at the end. If you really wanted to get serious about it, you would actually have to resample, because at the moment you have too few farm households because you're using data points near the end. At the beginning you had vastly more farm households. So you could do that, but I doubt the marginal returns would be, terribly high. What's going to happen is that with lower productivity, households are going to be more dependent, on they're trying to feed themselves, and so they're going to be more dependent. They're going to have less ability to sell labor off farm and so on. So you will see changes, but I don't think the marginal gain of doing resampling and so on is going to be worth it. But that's my initial judgment.
I see Rob coming on, but I want to get to the other papers first, and then we'll come back to Rob after Keith. Juris, let me propose that you address the simple G global questions, land supply, and that Alfredo chime in briefly to talk about the intermediate inputs as a degrader potentially of biodiversity.
Yeah, so regarding especially the land supply for the grid parameters, I think the best estimate that we can use would be from the work by Nelson and you in terms of the land supply elasticities for Americas. But yeah, I understand that those are just cross-sectional, so we may need to adjust them based on, especially when we're doing these long-run projections. Maybe we need to adjust them so they become more elastic. But yeah, this is going to be something that we will have to do once we impose these elasticities and see whether we're going to generate the historical changes or not. And then it's also the limited focus of that study also makes it difficult to extend the elasticities to other regions. So maybe we need to pair some grid cells based on certain biophysical characteristics so that they'll adopt whatever estimate that they are getting for what estimate is being calculated for a grid cell from the original paper. Maybe plug that into let's say Southeast Asia or a grid cell in Sub-Saharan Africa. But yeah, there are a lot of missing data, so we need to be very careful in terms of documenting the approach that we're pursuing in order to populate the information that we need for this global gridded analysis.
So yeah, Hans, it's a big enough headache to parameterize your magnet, then put it on a grid. That's a lot of parameters. I would say, in Juris's defense, he shows from the backcasting experiment that he seems to be partitioning land and yield growth in a reasonable way. So it must be, on average, the land supply elasticities globally aren't too bad. Getting them down to the grid cell level and where the land supply responds, that's a more challenging question. So yeah, you're pressing on the right points. I mean, the sensitive points there, Hans. Alfredo, do you have comments about this question about what drives biodiversity change? You're just doing cropland expansion. What about other things?
Yeah, that's right. Right now, we're only measuring in terms of land use change. But I think it is interesting because fertilizers and pesticides for sure have an impact on biodiversity. I guess we can make maybe some assumptions. Like, I mean, what I'm thinking is that maybe mammals and birds are not as sensitive, or maybe say that reptiles and amphibians are. And maybe, I don't know, like maybe just say like a range or something. We could definitely try that. Actually, Tom and I, we were talking about applying this in a particular species for bees and see how they will be affected, maybe in the US, that we have better information. And I think it will make more sense if we're focusing on one species in that sense. But like try to do it for several species, yeah, we will definitely have to make some big assumptions to make some calculations. But maybe it's just worth doing the exercise, like it will lead to more research in the future.
I mean, it sounds like you need input from ecologists and others to really do this. Okay, we've come around to you, Keith. So there was quite a list. Because Hans got your PPT first, there were about 10 slides. That circulated all the way around Washington University. And basically, everyone got their oar in. Keith, pick two things.
Yeah, no, those were fantastic comments. I really appreciate that, Hans. Those are great ideas, very thought-provoking. Let me just focus on this one issue of attribution in terms of, what is a CGIAR technology, and and as you note, these are all really, they're joint technology products of which the CGIAR is a contributor along with other partners. And, the key partner are the National Agricultural Research Systems, which may sometimes include the private sector, but primarily includes public research systems, but also includes advanced research institutes in developed countries that are collaborating in agricultural science and technology. So to say that, well, we have 57 billion per year and that's due to CGIAR is not correct. And so I think the issue there is to what we're trying to do is, so far we have an estimate of an aggregate benefit from technologies that have some direct linkage to CGIAR. But if we, if our objective is to take it a step further and say, well, what's the returns to R&D, then we really have to either say we have to add in the R&D contributions to partner organizations and say this is a return to this joint investment, or we have to say, well, of that 57 billion, maybe we can only attribute half or some fraction to the CGIAR expenditure. That's been the typical way this has been in the past. And with crop varieties, the way studies have done it is they've they look at the parentage of a variety and attribute ownership of the parents to various institutions. So if one parent came from the CGIAR and the other parent came from a national program, then the CGIAR would be attributed to half the yield gain. And if it was one grandparent, then a quarter of the yield gain, and so forth. And so that's one way to do this. I think it's probably what we will try to do is make some simple assumptions about attributing some share of that total impact to the CGIAR, and maybe that share could be declining over time as NAR's capacity and NAR's contributions as National Agricultural Research Program is growing. The other way is we might actually try to to look at a total R&D investment by the CGIAR and national partners to try to augment that total, to try to look at sort of the total investment that went into these technologies. But it's however we go about doing it, I think is going to be quite imprecise in terms of trying to attribute returns to components of this broader global research partnership.
Thank you.
I wanted to circle around to the co-authors, Ruben, Rob, and anyone else. Ruben, since Keith was just talking, and I think you were a co-author on that, why don't you add to Keith and then back to Rob for some of those other jobs?
Yeah, thank you. No, Keith, as usual, did all the work. I've been only the bodyguard here, but I just wanted to mention a couple of points to add. This has been a great discussion. Most of the time on attribution, when you do rate of returns, you usually, it's always an estimate. So just to be nice, we in the last 50 years, we've been saying, well, how about half and half? How about 50% attribution? Now, this is not a rate of return study, but in any case, I mean, that discussion should not distract us for the number. The number is huge, even if you take 50%. Okay, I give you 70%, Hans. 30% of that number is a huge number. So anyway, that's one. The other one is that the other point I wanted to make is that the literature is full of cases showing that agricultural research per se is not a great lever to reduce poverty. So we shouldn't forget, I think, who am I against all of these professors to talk about the big picture? But I think if you look at policies, education, infrastructure, and so many other things, agricultural research is a very small, very important, but a very small element in the whole formula when you do this big salad. So let's not forget that one. So the CGIAR has had a huge return on food security or nutritional health, or in the last 30 years on environment, landscape restoration, carbon sinking. I mean, there's a lot of things. So we are only focusing on crops that over time, the CGIAR is doing much less. If you look at the last 20 years, there's a huge, as many people have mentioned that. So there are many other things that if you put all together, I am biased, of course, but I think it's been a huge contribution with partners. The second point I wanted to make is that areas are not, 1 hectare is not the same as 1 hectare. The point is, if you're a wheat or a rice grower, you may be much more commercial farming type than if you are a grain, legume, sweet potato, or cassava farmer. So the impacts on poverty, it depends who is farming those crops. Anyway, that's another angle to say that if you consider the 19 crops, not only 2, on that study, you may have a much bigger effort. And the last one, just since I have the microphone, just 1 second, is to say, if you look at one of the slides of Keith showing that Argentina, India, China, the billions attributed to those countries, they have not put any money into the CGIAR or to the global contribution. That could be a great element to have a big discussion in the global south. Thank you very much.
Okay, Rob, over to you.
Thanks, Tom, and also thanks to Hans for grateful comments. Since Keith and Ruben already covered quite a bit of ground, and also before Will, just 2 quick remarks. First, on Hans's comment on conflict of interest, that's of course well noted. But at the same time, there's nothing wrong with doing self-evaluation, so I don't think that should bite each other. So we can do it as long as we do it in the right way. The second one is also adding a little bit on the issue of attribution. So Ruben already alluded to that. There's quite a few complexities. So it's easiest than what we're doing is to focus on the crop and the improved varieties because it's pretty straightforward. But even that said, the CGIAR does a lot of other stuff, including, of course, what we do, policy research. So So any new technology without enabling policy environments may not thrive, right? So how much contribution comes from what we do, and likewise what others do on better management of natural resources, soils, water, and so on, that also contributes. But the attribution there is a lot more complex because it runs more indirectly, and particularly when it comes to policy, that depends on the stakeholders in countries what they take in terms of our advice, right? So it's different from just sort of seeing a technology being adopted, and but even if we see a policy that we recommended being adopted, we can not even be sure that it's because of us or some other reason that they adopted the policy. So there's issues there, but it's certainly when we interpret the results, it's something we have to take into account, number one, and secondly, when we also come to, it's also been done in this literature, to a benefit cost analysis of what are the benefits from CGIAR, then some of these costs into these other things that are not strictly on the economic improvements, but rather on the enabling environment that enables the adoption, as well as it improves the conditions under which these technologies can thrive. So there's not that much we can do, but in interpretation, we should take those things into account.
So the bottom line is subtract IFPRI's budget from the going into this cost-benefit analysis. Is that right?
That would be a conflict of self-interest. Go against our interest. So we won't say that.
Okay. Great session. I think we're going to have to wind it down. Hans, do you want to say anything? We've given everyone a chance to respond to responses and whatnot, but
like I just say, I wish you all success with this very interesting project, and we look forward to getting more results from this very interesting group.
Yeah, and thanks to Keith for spearheading this whole effort, and all the people who've been working on it. It is very important, and gives us a rare chance to also compare across these methods and really sort out in a thorough way, the way as Keith and Will have talked about, how to use these estimates in our models. So, well, thanks to everyone for a very good session, very productive. It's really moved this project along substantially, I think. So we'll be reconvening, I believe, at 11 for the closing session. So you get a bit of a coffee break now, and we'll look forward to seeing you back at the top of the hour.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.